Almost from the moment Henry VIII laid eyes on Anne Boleyn, the sharp, distinctive, and utterly unsubmissive woman, he was drawn into an obsession he could no longer control. But their story did not end with a happy wedding. It ended on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn is now remembered as the queen executed by her own husband. At least, that's the story commonly told. But many modern historians argue there was a far more troubling reason behind her downfall. The woman who caused a king to break with the entire church was no ordinary beauty. Anne grew up in an environment heavily influenced by the French court, receiving a thorough education, refined manners, and especially the ability to think independently. This made her completely different from the women of England at the time. Meanwhile, Henry, after many years of rule and growing increasingly lustful, tyrannical, and uncontrollable, was not merely seeking a wife. He wanted someone who could satisfy both his ambitions and his ego. When he began pursuing Anne around 1526, he did not receive the response he desired. Anne refused to become his mistress. She rejected him coldly and stubbornly, something almost unimaginable in the Tudor court. Ironically, that very refusal only deepened Henry's obsession. He didn't just want Anne, he had to have her. Unlike other women, Anne did not back down, and that turned their relationship into a dangerous confrontation from the very beginning. Everyone knew Henry could be ruthless, but not everyone understood just how horrific things would become when he failed to get what he wanted. And for Anne, the only woman who dared stand as his equal, the price was her very life. Unlike any other woman in the English court at the time, Anne Boleyn returned from France with a completely different demeanor, sharp, sophisticated, and somewhat unpredictable. Rather than obedient and pliable like traditional English ladies, she was not a beauty by the standards of the era, but she possessed something far more dangerous: quick wit and the ability to command attention. And that was precisely what drew Henry VIII, a king accustomed to having everything under his control. By around 1525, Henry began taking a serious interest in Anne, while still married to Catherine of Aragon and having already had a precedent with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn. At first, this attention seemed unremarkable. Henry was notorious for his lust and frequent extramarital affairs, but Anne was unlike any woman he had ever encountered. When Henry began his pursuit, she did not respond as he expected. Instead of becoming his mistress, Anne refused outright, kept her distance, and set a clear condition: if he wanted her, Henry would have to marry her. In the context of the Tudor court, where the king's power was absolute and most women had no real choice, this was an extraordinarily bold, indeed reckless move. Yet it was precisely that stubbornness that pulled Henry in even deeper. From 1527 onward, Henry began openly displaying his obsession through letters to Anne, in which he called her the mistress of his heart and expressed his desperate longing to be with her, revealing an emotional dependency rarely seen in a king. He didn't just want Anne, he needed her, and the very fact that he couldn't have her immediately only intensified his desire. In this relationship, the balance of power began to shift in an unusual way. Though Henry held supreme authority, he found himself drawn into a game he could not fully control. By holding firm and refusing to yield, Anne unwittingly placed herself in an extremely dangerous position, becoming the only person in the court who could say no to the king. And that was exactly what transformed this relationship from an ordinary romance into a psychological conquest, in which Henry was not only trying to win Anne, but also to reassert his own power over a woman he refused to submit. As the relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn grew increasingly intense, it quickly expanded beyond a personal pursuit and turned into a national crisis known as the King's Great Matter. Henry no longer hid his intention to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The stated reason was her failure to produce a son, but in reality, Anne had become the center of every decision. The king believed his marriage was a mistake before God and began seeking to annul it legally, requesting papal approval. On the king's direction. She supported reformist ideas, encouraged Henry to believe his power did not need to depend on the Pope, and gradually reinforced the notion that the king could decide religious matters in his own realm. This completely changed how Henry viewed his position. From a man trying to resolve a marital issue, he became a direct challenger to a centuries-old religious system. When Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, tasked with handling the divorce, failed to deliver results, he quickly lost power and was removed from the centre of court, demonstrating the severity of the issue and the price paid for failing the king. From then on, the court split sharply. One side supported Anne and the changes she represented. The other remained loyal to Catherine and the old order. The atmosphere grew tense and suspicious, with every political decision shaped by this relationship. Ultimately, Henry took an irreversible step. He broke from the Catholic Church and declared supreme control over the Church of England, an action that not only resolved his marriage problem, but reshaped the entire power structure of the country. Throughout the process, Anne was not merely the woman Henry wanted to marry. She was the catalyst that escalated everything beyond control. A personal relationship led to the transformation of an entire nation, and once things had gone too far, there was no room for mistakes or retreat, because by then, it was no longer the story of two individuals, but of the absolute power Henry had created and could no longer abandon. By around 1527, the relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had moved into its decisive phase. It was no longer a passionate pursuit, but had become the most vicious power struggle in the Tudor court, known as the King's Great Matter. Henry no longer concealed his dissatisfaction with his decades-long marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the lack of a son served as the perfect pretext for what he truly wanted: to remove his old wife and marry Anne at any cost. He demanded the Pope annul the marriage, but when refused, Henry's reaction was not acceptance. It was rage, and viewing it as an unforgivable insult. A king accustomed to obedience would not tolerate being controlled, and from that point, everything began to spiral beyond but a stubborn, ambitious woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and that made her dangerous. Henry transformed from a man obsessed with a woman into someone willing to shatter an entire religious system just to get what he wanted. When Cardinal Thomas Wolsey failed to resolve the matter, he was immediately disgraced and stripped of power, a brutal fall that showed Henry's intolerance for anyone who stood in his way. The court quickly descended into sharp division. One side backed Anne and the radical changes she represented. The other clung to the old order and saw her as a threat to be eliminated. The atmosphere turned toxic, filled with intrigue and hostility, as everyone understood this was no longer a love affair but a fight for survival at the heart of power. And then Henry took the irreversible step, not with hesitation, but with a decisive and ruthless decision, breaking from the Catholic Church and placing himself above all. With the Act of Supremacy in 1534, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, an act that not only solved the marriage issue but destroyed a centuries-old religious order. This was no mere reform, it was a blatant seizure of power, with Henry replacing the Pope with himself. Throughout the entire process, Anne was not just the woman behind the scenes, she was the catalyst that pushed everything to the extreme. The one who drove Henry from obsession to extremism. A personal relationship had become the cause of one system's collapse and another's formation, and once things had gone this far, there was no room for regret or retreat. Henry had placed himself in a position where failure was impossible, and in such a world, anyone who became a problem, even Anne, would be eliminated without hesitation. By 1533, after years of obsessive pursuit and breaking every boundary, Anne Boleyn finally achieved what almost no one dared dream of. She became Queen of England, officially marrying Henry VIII, the man who had been willing to tear apart the entire religious order just to possess her. Anne's coronation was not merely a ceremony, it was a declaration of power, an affirmation that she had triumphed over everything: the church, the court, and the previous queen. But this pinnacle was far from secure, and from the very moment it was achieved, cracks began to appear. Anne was not the type of queen who knew how to stay silent and obedient. She intervened in politics, influenced religious decisions, and openly displayed her power, something that made many in the court despise her and view her as a threat. She was not just the king's wife, she acted like a power partner, and in a system where only one person was allowed to hold control, that was dangerous. When Anne gave birth in September 1533, instead of the male heir Henry desperately craved, she delivered Elizabeth. Though the child was healthy, Henry's disappointment was impossible to hide. From then on, everything began to slide. Anne's subsequent pregnancy yielded no results, and when she miscarried, especially the loss of a son in early 1536, Henry no longer saw her as his fated woman, but as a grave mistake. For a lustful, power-obsessed king like Henry, the absence of a son was not just personal failure, it was a direct threat to his legacy. And when Anne could no longer deliver that, her value in Henry's eyes began to collapse. At the same time, the very traits that had once made Anne irresistible by the conquest of Anne now found no excitement in possessing her. He didn't crave stability, he was addicted to the chase, and once the hunt ended, his interest vanished quickly. And then, as in a familiar cycle, a new woman appeared, Jane Seymour. Unlike Anne, Jane was gentle, soft-spoken, and knew how to submit precisely the image Henry now considered ideal. Jane's presence was not just a new relationship, it was a replacement gradually taking shape, an escape route Henry began to pursue. While Anne still tried to hold her position, Henry emotionally withdrew and the distance between them grew wider. The once obsessive relationship had turned into a series of cold interactions, with both sides realizing things were no longer the same. What had once made Anne special, her ability to challenge, her strong personality, her independence, now became the reason she could not survive in the system Henry had created. A king who accepted no opposition could not keep a woman who refused to submit by his side. And when Anne was no longer a target of conquest but a problem to be controlled, her fate was nearly sealed. Because in Henry's world, where power was absolute and loyalty mandatory, anyone who made him feel he was losing control, no matter how deeply loved before, would soon be eliminated. This time that person was Anne. In early 1536, when the relationship between Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII had already rotted from the inside, Anne's downfall did not unfold gradually. It arrived suddenly and brutally, like a sentence that had been prepared in advance. Just a few months after the fateful miscarriage, Anne was arrested in May 1536 and taken to the Tower of London, no longer as queen but as a criminal awaiting execution. The charges levelled against her were enough to completely destroy her reputation: adultery with multiple men at court, incest with her own brother, and treason, a list of crimes so grave that there was no escape. But upon closer examination, these accusations were riddled with absurdity. The alleged times of the adulterous encounters overlapped, contradicted each other, and in some cases occurred when Anne was demonstrably elsewhere, making the acts impossible. The evidence relied mainly on coerced confessions and speculation, with no clear proof. But in a system where the outcome was predetermined, truth no longer mattered. Behind the entire process stood Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally but now turned against her, playing a pivotal role in constructing the case and removing her from power. This was no longer an investigation, it was a meticulously organized purge campaign. Meanwhile, Henry was no longer the man who had once written pleading letters, begging for Anne's love. He had become the final arbiter, cold and decisive. He did not defend her, did not question the charges, but accepted them swiftly as if they were necessary to move forward. Anne was completely isolated. Her allies vanished. No one dared stand by her in a court dominated by fear. The trial was not held to seek justice but to legitimize a foregone conclusion, and the death sentence was virtually inevitable. On May 19, 1536, Anne stepped onto the scaffold with astonishing calm. No resentment, no pleading, only acceptance of her fate in a system she had once helped shape. Her final words, praising the king as a good and just man, were not the truth but a wise choice in her last moments. And then, with a single stroke of the sword, it was over. But that death was not merely the end of a life, it was total erasure. Her reputation, her power, and her place in history were all distorted. What made the entire affair even more cruel was the speed of replacement. Just days later, Henry officially married Jane Seymour, as if Anne had never existed. The woman who had once driven him to break an entire religious system was now discarded like a mistake that needed correcting. This was not a personal tragedy, but a stark demonstration of how power operates in the hands of a man who accepts no failure, where love can turn to hatred, and when it does, the outcome is not merely separation but complete obliteration. After Anne Boleyn's death in 1536, everything seemed to end exactly as Henry VIII desired. A woman erased, a mistake corrected, and a court swiftly moving on as if nothing had happened. But history does not bend to the will of one man, and Anne's legacy did not vanish with that sword stroke. Her daughter, Elizabeth the Child, once dismissed as a failure because she was not a son, ultimately became Elizabeth I, one of the greatest queens in English history. This was the cruelest irony. Henry had broken with the church, sparked a revolution, and destroyed Anne, all in pursuit of a male heir. Yet his greatest legacy turned out to be the very daughter he had once disappointed. Under Elizabeth's reign, England entered its golden age. Power, consolidated, culture and politics flourished, and all of it bore the indirect imprint of Anne, the woman once branded a mistake. Yet, Anne's image in history has rarely been fair. For centuries, she was vilified as a seductress, an ambitious woman, even cast in distorted roles as a witch or moral destroyer. That was not the truth. It was the product of a power system that needed to justify her elimination. Only in modern times have historians begun to re-examine the case, questioning the flimsy evidence, the contradictory accusations, and Anne's true role in the entire saga. Looking back at the relationship between Henry and Anne, it is clear this was not an ordinary failed romance, but the consequence of absolute power in the hands of a man who tolerated no opposition. Henry did not merely love Anne, he wanted to control her. And when he realized that was impossible, eliminating her became the only option in his logic of power. Anne was not a completely passive victim. She was a player in a dangerous game, a woman who dared demand equality with the king, and that made her extraordinary, but also unacceptable. This relationship did not just destroy one woman, it transformed all of England from religion and politics to the very structure of power. And the final question remains, not to find a simple answer, but to understand the nature of power and humanity. Was Anne Boleyn a cursed queen, or simply the only woman who dared stand as an equal to a king and paid the price for it? If you want to explore more stories of power and tragedy like this in history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next Elite Legacy Stories.